All right, so are great leaders born or are they made? Question, like everybody asks, right? You always hear people say someone's a born leader, but is that really true? I mean, we've got some fascinating stuff to dig into today, looking at how leadership theories explain this whole thing, especially these excerpts on individual focused theories, which is what we're diving deep into today. We've got chapter 4 from Leadership Theory, Cultivating Critical Perspectives, and then that academic study, Personality and Leadership. How Gender Impacts Perceptions of Effectiveness, which I have to say is a really intriguing title.
Yeah, and it's wild how much we still focus on the individual when we talk about leadership, even now. It's like everyone's trying to crack the code.
Yeah.
Like what's the secret sauce? Is it personality skills? Almost like there's this leadership gene out there that some people just like win the lottery with.
Totally. Like, are some people just, I don't know, born with that leadership gene? Which, actually, speaking of, our textbook starts by going way back, like great man theory territory. I can't believe that's even still a thing people talk about.
Right. It's amazing how these ideas stick around. Carlyle, back in 1841, was all about this, saying some people, like Napoleon, totally extraordinary, naturally cut out to lead.
Super chosen one vibes.
Totally. And then you've got Galton, who took it even further with, get this, hereditary genius, basically saying some folks are genetically predisposed to lead, while others, well, not so much.
Wow. Okay, so how do we get from great men to how the textbook talks about traits today? Because at least they acknowledge it's not all genetics, thankfully.
Well, research changes, right? The textbook talks about Stockdale, who really challenged that born leader thing back in the 40s. He was like, hold on, individual traits matter, but the situation you're in, the environment, that plays a huge role too. Plus, tons of these so-called leadership traits, you can just learn them.
So it's nature and nurture working together. And there's actual data on this, right? Those twin studies in the book blew my mind.
Absolutely. They found only about 24% to 32% of what makes someone emerge as a leader is genetic. The rest, environment. Think about that. Where you are, what you're exposed to, could matter even more than your genes when it comes to leadership.
That is kind of a game changer. Means we're not just stuck with whatever we were born with. But then it makes you wonder, what does emerge as a leader even mean in those studies?
You hit on something really important there. Those twin studies mostly looked at whether someone actually got a formal leadership position, not how effective they were as a leader. So someone might have traits that get them chosen for a leadership role. Doesn't mean they'll be any good at it.
Right, like that makes sense. It's like saying someone might be genetically predisposed to be tall, which maybe some people think makes them look like a leader, but doesn't mean they'll actually be good at, leading a team.
Exactly. That's why just focusing on traits can be so misleading. The textbook even calls trait-based research the junkyard of leadership scholarship. There's
Yeah.
just so much of it, it's hard to know what's valuable and what's, well, junk.
I laughed out loud at that line because they are not wrong. They literally said you could pick any personality trait, and I guarantee there's a study out there linking it to leadership.
Exactly. And that's the problem, right? With so much data, it's easy to find research that just backs up what you already believe, even if that belief is biased. We have to think critically about what traits are actually connected to being an effective leader, not just fitting some stereotype.
Okay, so let's get into some specifics. I know we wanted to talk about a few trait-based approaches that you flagged from my notes. The leadership challenge model, emotionally intelligent leadership, and strengths-based leadership. All super popular, but are they legit?
They've all got their strengths, pun intended, we'll get to that.
Yeah.
Like the Leadership Challenge model is huge, over 2 million copies of their book sold. They talk about 5 practices for good leadership: modeling the way, inspiring a shared vision, challenging the process, enabling others to act, and encouraging the heart.
Wow, that's a mouthful, but it sounds pretty thorough.
Yeah.
And then there's emotionally intelligent leadership, which, as the name suggests, is all about self-awareness, managing your emotions, connecting with others, all good stuff.
Totally. And then you've got strengths-based leadership coming from the positive psychology world. Basically, figure out your natural talents, then build those into strengths. This one's gotten super popular, especially with things like the Clifton Strengths Finder. Have you ever taken that?
Oh, yeah, I did that once. I think my top strength was strategic or something. I don't know. It always felt a little subjective to me.
And that's actually common criticism. Some people question if it's really scientific or transparent.
Right. Okay, so these approaches, they're popular, catchy, maybe helpful for thinking about yourself, but that doesn't automatically mean you'll be a good leader.
And that's where things get even trickier. Remember that anecdote you highlighted about the graduate student in the job interview?
Yeah, vaguely. Remind me.
So he's nailing the interview, seems like a perfect fit, and then they ask his top strength. He says something that, turns out, everyone on their team is already strong in.
Oh, no. I'm guessing that didn't go well.
Not at all. They reject him because they want to diversify their strengths, which ironically meant not hiring someone strong in the same area as everyone else, even if he was a good candidate otherwise.
So even if strengths-based leadership has some truth to it, how people actually use it can be totally off.
It's a great example of why we can't oversimplify these things. Plus, that story reminds us that a strength in one situation might be a weakness in another. It's all about context.
Which brings me to what I think is glaringly missing from a lot of these personality-focused leadership theories. They barely touch on the role of power, social context, and everyone's individual experiences.
Huge point. It's like these theories assume everyone's starting on an even playing field, which is so not true.
Exactly. Like that study, Personality and Leadership, how gender impacts perceptions of effectiveness. It goes deep on this, right? Saying that even when women and men show the exact same leadership behaviors, they're often perceived totally differently because of stereotypes.
100%. Let's say a woman is assertive in a meeting, maybe challenges the way things are usually done. You think those traits get received the same way if it was a white male leader doing it? Likely not. And it's because of deeply ingrained biases.
It's like they're being judged on two completely different scorecards, even when doing the same stuff.
Which is exactly why we can't just take these person-centered theories at face value.
So where do we go from here? We've spent all this time picking these theories apart, but what's someone actually trying to develop their leadership skills? Or who's in a leadership role right now? What are they supposed to do with all this? Okay, so tell me more about this better model, this more nuanced model. Is this gonna unlock the secret to good leadership for me?
Well, it's definitely a step in the right direction. So this model gets that traits are important, but instead of just listing out good leader traits, it kind of sorts them into these categories: deep determinants, distal attributes, and proximal attributes.
Okay, those sound very textbooky. Help me out here.
Think of it like layers, okay? Deep determinants, those are like the foundation, stuff that's really tough to change. Your race, gender, even things like your height, mostly influenced by genetics and how you were raised.
Got it. So those are kind of set from the start. What about the other layers?
Right, so on top of that, you've got distal attributes, more internal stuff, your personality, how conscientious you are, how open you are to new experiences, that kind of thing. These can change, but it takes time, effort.
So you're saying I can learn to be more open to trying new things, but it's not going to happen overnight.
Exactly. And then the very top layer, the most changeable, those are proximal attributes. This is your skills, your knowledge, stuff you gain through experience, learning, how you communicate, how well you analyze information, all falls under this.
So it's like a hierarchy of traits, basically. Deep stuff at the bottom influences the next layer up, and that influences the most changeable stuff at the top.
You got it. And here's where it gets really cool. The model also gets that these traits don't exist in a vacuum. They're always bumping up against your organizational context, company culture, your team, and then the even bigger social context. Societal norms, power structures, even those unconscious biases we talked about.
So even if you have all the right personality traits, according to some textbook, if you're in a workplace that doesn't value that, you're not going to be as effective.
Exactly. Plus, remember we were talking about implicit leadership theory before, how we all have these biases about what a good leader looks like, how they should act.
Yeah, and those biases are hugely shaped by social context, right? Media, stories we hear, even our own experiences.
100%.
Yeah.
So someone's leadership potential isn't just about what traits they have. It's about how those traits get seen through the lens of those implicit biases. And that's where things can get really unfair, because those perceptions aren't always right.
Hit me with a real-world example of how this plays out.
Imagine two people, equally qualified, totally capable. One is a white man, the other is a woman of color. They both show assertiveness in a meeting, but because of bias, she might be seen as aggressive or difficult, while he's seen as, confident, decisive. Same behavior, totally different interpretations.
It's like they're playing by two different sets of rules, even though they're doing the exact same thing.
All the time. That's why this model is so important. It makes you think about those biases, how they might be affecting how you see other people's leadership potential. You can't just have a checklist of traits without the bigger picture.
That reminds me of something you'd highlighted for my notes about that time someone at work told me to, tone it down a bit.
Oh, what happened?
They said, my strategic thinking, my initiative, it was coming across as too strong, too much. Looking back, I can't help but wonder if, My age and gender played a role in how that was perceived. Like, if I was older, maybe even male, those same traits might have been seen as good things.
Yeah.
Wow.
It really makes you think. That's exactly why it's so important to really unpack these theories,
Yes.
challenge those assumptions. Think about how they might actually be reinforcing inequalities, even if we don't mean to.
Okay, so where do we go from here? We've spent all this time deconstructing these theories, talking about their flaws and blind spots, but for someone who's actually trying to improve their leadership skills, or even someone who's in a leadership position right now, what do we do with this information? So we spent this whole time, right, really digging into these person-centered leadership theories, what they miss, how they can be biased, even how our own experiences, our backgrounds, like play into how we see leadership. For someone listening, what's the big takeaway you hope they walk away with?
For me, it comes down to this. Leadership isn't some checklist of traits. It's not like you've either got it or you don't. It's way more about the process. And that process always exists within a context, right? Company culture, what society expects, even those implicit biases we were talking about.
So it's less about trying to be some perfect leader and more about how you navigate all that complexity.
Exactly. And that's why I wouldn't say just throw out these person-centered theories entirely. Even with their flaws, they can be helpful for self-reflection. Like
Yeah.
if you know you're more introverted, you can be like, okay, what strategies can I use to communicate better in a big group?
Mm.
Or maybe I should look for leadership opportunities that really play to my strengths. It's about knowing what you're working with and making the most of it.
Knowing yourself, your strengths, your weaknesses, and then how those might land on other people in different environments.
Yeah. And using that awareness to adapt. Flexibility is key.
It's like, don't be afraid to question those perceptions, too. Just because someone sees you as quiet, reserved, doesn't mean you can't lead. You might just lead in a way that plays to those qualities.
Absolutely. And that's why it's so important to have all different kinds of leaders. We need those different styles, different perspectives, different approaches if we're actually going to solve complex problems.
We need people who are going to come at it from all these different angles.
Exactly. And we need workplaces
Mhm.
where those different styles are valued, celebrated, not just, tolerated.
So we've got understanding ourselves, challenging our own biases, being aware of the context. That's a lot, but where do you even start with building those skills?
I'm going to sound cheesy, but honestly, curiosity.
Hmm.
Be curious about yourself, about other people, about how the world works. Read a lot. Talk to people. Be open to feedback, even when it's tough to hear.
And experiment a little. See what works for you. Don't be afraid to try things, make mistakes. That's how we learn.
Right. The best leadership trait might not be some big flashy thing. It might just be the ability to learn, adapt, grow as the world changes around you.
I love that. So it's not about being the perfect leader. It's about being on the journey, always learning.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
This has been awesome. So much to think about. Leadership, it's messy, it's complicated, and it's always changing. So keep asking questions, keep learning, and let's keep working to make the world a more equitable, inclusive place where everyone has the chance to lead. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.